Fremantle Prison, sometimes referred to as Fremantle Jail or Fremantle Jail, is a former Australian prison in Fremantle, Western Australia. The 6-hectare site includes the prison cell blocks, gatehouse, perimeter walls, cottages, and tunnels. Initially known as the Convict Establishment or the Establishment, it was constructed as a prison for convicts, using convict labour. Between 1851 and 1859, the prison was transferred to the colonial government in 1886 for use for locally sentenced prisoners. Royal commissions were held in 1898 and 1911, and instigated some reform to the prison system, but significant changes did not begin until the 1960s. The government department in charge of the prison underwent several reorganizations in the 1970s and 1980s, but the culture of Fremantle Prison was resistant to change. Growing prisoner discontent culminated in a 1988 riot with guards taken hostage and a fire that caused $1.8 million worth of damage. The prison closed in 1991, replaced by the new maximum security Gnangarra prison. The prison was administered by Controller General, Sheriff, or Director, responsible for the entire convict prison system in Western Australia, and a superintendent in charge of the prison itself. Prison officers, known as warders in the 19th century, worked under stringent conditions until they achieved representation through the Western Australian Prison Officers Union. Convicts were initially of good character as potential future colonists, but less desirable convicts were eventually sent. As a locally run prison, Fremantle's population was generally short-sentenced white prisoners in the 1890s, with very few Aboriginal prisoners. By the late 20th century, most prisoners were serving longer sentences. A higher proportion of them were violent, and Aboriginal people were overrepresented. Prison life at Fremantle was highly regulated. Meals were an important part of the day, eaten in the cells throughout the operational life of the prison. Convict or prisoner labour was used on public infrastructure works until around 1911. Subsequently, only work inside the prison was allowed, though there was never enough to fully occupy the inmates. Punishments varied over the years, with flogging and time in irons eventually replaced by lengthening of sentences and deprivation of visitors or entertainment. More than 40 hangings were carried out at Fremantle Prison, which was Western Australia's only lawful place of execution, between 1888 and 1984. Prominent escapees included Moonline Joe, as well as John Boyle O'Reilly and 6 other Fenians in the 19th century, and Brendan Abbott in 1989. There have been various riots and other disturbances, with major riots causing damage in 1968 and 1988. Since 1991, Fremantle Prison has been conserved as a recognised heritage site, and various restoration works have been undertaken. New uses have been found for some buildings within the prison, which has also become a significant tourist attraction. The process of obtaining World Heritage listing as part of the Australian Convict Sites submission focused historical interpretation and conservation efforts on the prison's convict era, at the expense of its more recent history, including Aboriginal prisoners held there. Architecture. Layout. Fremantle Prison was built on a land grant of about 36 acres from limestone quarried on site. A 15-foot-tall boundary wall encloses the prison grounds, with a gatehouse in the centre of the western wall, facing the terrace. Other roads bounding the site are Knutsford Street to the north, Hampton Road to the east, and Fothergill Street to the south. Cottages, which housed prison workers and officials, are located outside the wall either side of the gatehouse. Inside the walls, the parade ground is located east of the gatehouse. Beyond it is the main cell block at the center of the site, which contains 2 chapels. North of the main block is New Division, and west of that, in the northwestern corner, is the former women's prison, previously the cookhouse, bakehouse and laundry. The hospital building stands in the northeastern corner, while the former workshops are located in the southeastern corner, as well as to the north of the gatehouse. A system of underground tunnels, constructed to provide fresh water from an aquifer, runs under the eastern edge of the site. Buildings houses on the terrace, north of the gatehouse, located at 2, 4, and 6 the terrace, are cottages built in Victorian style, in contrast to the Georgian style of the other houses. Number 10 is a double-storey house, initially built in 1853 for the chaplain, but taken over by the superintendent in 1878 and later used by the prison administration. An adjoining single-storey at number 12, finished in 1854, was the home of the gatekeeper, located on the north side of the gatehouse. Number 16, the terrace, south of the gatehouse, is a double-storey house that accommodated first the superintendent, and later the resident magistrate. It remained in use as housing for prison officers until the 1970s. Number 18, the southernmost house on the terrace, and number 8, the northernmost of the initial buildings, both featured 2 sitting rooms, 3 bedrooms, and 2 dressing rooms, as well as a kitchen, water closet and shed, but with mirrored layouts. Number 18 was expanded with additions built in the 1890s. Gatehouse. The gatehouse and associated entry complex was constructed between 1854 and 1855 using convict labour. It was designed by Royal Engineer and Controller General Edmund Henderson, and constructed out of limestone. The gatehouse has 2 towers either side of a narrow gate, reminiscent of those found in 13th-century English castles or walled cities. Iron that had been scavenged from shipwrecks was used to make the gate, while the clock at the top of the structure was imported from England. As the main entrance, the gatehouse has remained a significant feature and landmark since the closure of the prison. It has housed a cafe and office areas. Restoration was carried out in 2005, preserving the original stone facade and removing non-original rendering. Main cell block little changed since its construction in the 1850s by convicts. The main cell block was designed to hold up to 1,000 prisoners. The central, 4-story high cell block is flanked on either end by large dormitory wards, called the association rooms. Here, as many as 80 men slept in hammocks, either as a reward for good behavior or because they would soon receive the ticket of leave. In contrast, the cramped cells measured just 7 by 4 feet, although each cell initially had a basin connected to running water. The installation was before the advent of aspirins. The smells coming up the pipes led to the removal by the 1860s. Following a royal commission, the cells were enlarged by removing a dividing wall from between 2 cells. Electric lighting was installed in the 1920s, but there were never any toilets. Buckets were used for the duration of the prison's operation. Since the prison's closure, 6 cells have been restored to represent the varying living conditions at different times in the prison's history. The main block also houses the gallows, solitary confinement cells, and 2 chapels, Anglican and Catholic. New Division. Fremantle Prison's New Division building was constructed between 1904 and 1907 as a response to overcrowding. It also allowed prison administrators to implement the separate system, whereby prisoners were completely isolated for the first 3 months of the sentence. A panopticon in the exercise yard was initially used to facilitate this concept during the prisoner's hour of exercise each day. The system was not successful and considered a dated prisoner management strategy, leading to its removal within 5 years. New Division division was the first building to have electricity, with underground wiring. During World War II, the Australian Army appropriated the division to keep the prisoners separate from the main population. In 1994, the building was retrofitted to cater for offices, small business premises, and meeting rooms. Women's prison. The northwestern complex was originally a service area with a cookhouse, bakehouse and laundry. Built in the 1850s, a place for women prisoners was needed following the closure of Perth Jail and the transfer of prisoners to Fremantle. The buildings were converted to a prison, and a wall built around them, creating Western Australia's first separate prison for women. Population and crime growth led to them being extended in the 1890s and 1910s. The construction of bound-up women's prison saw Fremantle's women's prison close in 1970, with the space used for education and assessment until the main prison's closure in 1991. Hospital built between 1857 and 1859, the hospital was a crucial component of Fremantle Prison. Public works during the convict era relied on convict labour, which could only be provided if the convicts were healthy. From 1886 to 1903, medical services were relocated to the main cell block, with the former building used to keep invalids and female prisoners. The hospital was refurbished and reopened in 1904. It subsequently remained in continuous operation until the prison's closure in 1991. Workshops. The original workshop was a blacksmith's shop, one of the first buildings to be constructed on the prison site. Later known as the East Workshops, other workshops included carpenters, plumbers and painters, a printing office, and from the 1850s, a metal shop. The West Workshops were built at the start of the 20th century, providing more work for prisoners through paint shop, mat maker, shoemaker, bookbinder and tailor shop. In 1993, the four northern workshops were adapted for use as TAFE art workshops. Tunnels. In the 1850s, shafts were sunk into the limestone bedrock to provide the prison with fresh water from an aquifer, and a tank was installed in 1874 to offer the town of Fremantle an alternative water supply. Prisoners worked a pump to fill the tank, which was connected to the jetties through gravity-fed pipes. In 1896, a town reservoir was constructed on Swanbourne Street, fed from the prison by a triple expansion steam-driven pump that could take more than 4.5 megalitres per day from the prison tunnels. Prisoners, relieved of manual pumping, were employed to supply wooden stoke boilers. The tunnels were closed in 1910, though the groundwater continued to be used for the prison's gardens. In 1989, oil leaking from nearby tanks contaminated the water. However, the pollution was cleared by 1996 through bioremediation. The tunnels were reopened in mid-2005, and had been refurbished within a year to improve the experience for visitors. History. 19th century. While the Swan River Colony was established as a free settlement, by the 1840s demand for cheap labour overcame an early reluctance, and the colony agreed to accept some convicts from Britain. The arrival of the first convict ship Indian on the 2nd of June 1850 was unexpected, as a sailing ship that had been sent ahead had been blown off course. The colony's roundhouse jail was full, so the 75 convicts had to be left on the ship until a temporary prison was built. Controller General of Convicts Edward Henderson looked for a place to build a permanent convict establishment, and ultimately settled on the current site, on a hill overlooking Fremantle. The design for Fremantle Prison was based on the Pentonville Prison in Britain, but with diagonal cell blocks replaced with a 4-story linear structure, which would be the longest, tallest prison cell block in the Southern Hemisphere. Construction began in 1851, and work rapidly progressed following the arrival of the Royal Engineers later that year. They trained trained convicts to work with limestone, which was quarried on site. The first priority was the construction of accommodation for Henderson and the prison warders, to relieve the expense of paying for private lodging. The prison walls were constructed between 1853 and 1855, while the gatehouse and associated entry complex was built in 1854 and 1855. Construction of the southern half of the main cell block began in 1853, and was finished in 1855, with prisoners transferred from the temporary prison on 1 June 1855. Construction of the northern wing followed. The Crimean War, the Royal Engineers recalled, leaving only one of the number, Henry Ray, to oversee the building's construction, which was completed by the end of 1859. During Western Australia's convict era, the prison was known as the Convict Establishment, and was used for prisoners transported from Britain. Longer-term or locally sentenced prisoners were also held there from 1858, at a cost to the colonial government. In 1868, penal transportation to Western Australia ceased, and the number of convicts in the colony gradually declined, down to 83 in the mid-1880s. Due to the great expense of sending these convicts back to Britain, the authorities then negotiated with the colonial government to relinquish jurisdiction over them, as well as the prison complex. Demolition was considered too expensive. Early negotiations had broken down, but were restarted in August 1883. After 1.5 years, a compromise was reached, and the transfer was finalized on 31 March 1886. Once the prison came under the control of the colonial government, it was renamed Fremantle Prison. All prisoners in Perth Jail were transferred to Fremantle, and from 1887 female prisoners were also imprisoned there, in their own separate section. The Western Australian gold rushes of the 1890s resulted in strong economic growth, and a massive increase in population, doubling from almost 50,000 in 1891 to more than 100,000 by 1895, and to 184,000 by 1901. This influx included desperate, dishonest people from elsewhere in Australia and overseas, and Fremantle Prison was soon overcrowded. The 1890s also saw a growing public unease with the treatment of prisoners. In September 1898, a royal commission was established by the Governor of Western Australia to investigate the colony's penal system. The commission heard evidence from almost 240 witnesses, including a range of prisoners. 3 reports were made between December 1898 and June 1899, dealing with the most recognizable and prominent issues including classification, sentencing, punishments, and diet. In particular, they considered the philosophy of the prison system, the causes of crime, as well as the types of punishments and the justifications, and in light of this, the practicality of various reform proposals. Early 20th century. Within a year of the inquiry, almost 100 cells had been enlarged by knocking down the inner wall between 2 cells, and a classification system was introduced. Internal walls were constructed in the main block, creating 4 separate divisions. Following the urgings of the prison superintendent George and various official inquiries, new workshops were built to provide increased useful employment for prisoners. 5 spaces were designed for tailors, bookbinders, shoemakers, mapmakers and painters. New regulations for prison officers were published in the Government Gazette in 1902, and a new Prisons Act was passed in 1903. While in theory the passing of the Act should have resulted in significant prison reform, this did not eventuate. The legislation left much of the changes to executive regulation at the discretion of the governor, and was described by the media as a feeble document. New division, completed in 1907 and occupied in 1908, resulted from the 1899 Commissioner's report recommending a modified version of the separate system. The new division was similar in design to Henderson's 1850s structure, but was constructed in an L shape, was only 3 stories tall, and had electric lighting. It also differed in its use from the main cell block. Unlike occupants of the earlier building, prisoners remained continuously in the cells except when exercising in separate yards, watched panopticon-style by a warder in a central tower. In 1911, another Royal Commission investigation into Fremantle Prison recommended closing the facility. Its report was ignored by the state government, which was more concerned with building infrastructure such as roads and schools than the plight of its prisoners. However, there was a rapid change in prison policy, with the appointment of a superintendent, Hugh Han, who had recent English and colonial experience, and the election of a Labour government with members interested in penal reform. One immediate result was the dismantling of the separate system at Fremantle Prison and the demolition of the separate exercise yards in 1912. Fremantle Prison was partially used as a military prison during both World Wars, for the detention of military personnel, as well as an internment centre. From 1940 until 1946, it was one of more than 50 military prisons across Australia, holding a combined total of more than 12,000 enemy aliens and prisoners of war. Fremantle accommodated up to 400 military prisoners and up to 160 civilian prisoners by October 1945. The World War II takeover necessitated the commissioning of Batten's Mill Prison in 1942. 20th century reform. Prison outstations were established as part of the reforms in the 20th century, and to reduce the overcrowding at Fremantle, Pardalup Prison Farm opened in 1927 near Mount Barker, while Batten's Mill, though planned to be a temporary measure, remained open as a prison after World War II. Significant reform to Western Australia's prison system did not begin until the 1960s, lagging behind those which occurred elsewhere in Australia and the world after World War II. 7 new prisons were opened between 1960 and 1971, and in 1970, female prisoners and staff were moved from Fremantle to the new bound-up women's prison. New legislation regarding probation, parole, and convicted drunkards was also introduced, which provided alternatives to imprisonment. With these new arrangements, and more variety in prisons and prison types, a classification board was set up in 1963 to assess prisoners. The appointment of Colin Campbell as Controller General in 1966 fostered substantial changes within Fremantle Prison itself. One of his first changes was to clear the classification committee's backlog of prisoners awaiting assessment. Campbell also established an officer training school, as well as an assessment centre to evaluate new prisoners. Work release and community service programs were also introduced, along with training programs, social workers and welfare officers. Within the midst of Campbell's reforms, the Prisons Department was renamed the Department of Corrections in 1971, restructured, and the position of Controller General was replaced with Director of the Department. In 1972, a Royal Commission was appointed to investigate mistreatment and discrimination against Aboriginal prisoners. Its 1973 report found that there was not any appreciable discrimination. However, racial stereotypes are present throughout the report, and the testimony of Aboriginal prisoners was considered unreliable. The report also made recommendations regarding regarding various aspects of prison life, including additional independent, trained welfare officers. William Kidston succeeded Campbell in 1977, and oversaw a shift in policy from paternalistic rehabilitation of prisoners to merely providing opportunities for rehabilitation. A new Prisons Act was passed in 1981, which updated the 1903 Act with modern philosophies and practices. This act was, however, slanted towards prisoner management and safety, and the department was at the same time renamed the Prisons Department once more, to emphasize imprisonment as its primary responsibility. Ian Hill became director of the Prisons Department in 1983, and reorganized the department several times, striving for increased efficiency. Whilst the changes of the 1980s were effective throughout most of Western Australia's prison system, the culture of Fremantle Prison was resistant to change. Growing prisoner discontent eventually culminated in the 1988 prison riot, investigated by an official inquiry later that year. Closure and subsequent use. The state government made the decision to decommission Fremantle Prison in 1983, but it remained in operation until the 30th of November 1991. Prisoners were moved to a new metropolitan maximum security prison at Casuarina. There were divergent views in the community over the site's future, whether it should be preserved or redeveloped. The ultimate decision was for conservation of the prison, but allowing for the buildings to be adapted for reuse by the community. The Fremantle Prison Trust was established in 1992 to advise the Minister for Works on the management of the site. Various new uses were found for different parts of the prison, including wedding services in the chapels, the Coastal Business Centre in New Division, and the Fremantle Children's Literature Centre in the hospital. The prison also became a tourist attraction. A private company, the Fremantle Prison Guardians, organised the tourist operation for 10 years under contract, until the end of 2001. Subsequently, the state government took control. A hostel providing short-stay accommodation in the women's prison opened in May 2015.